acknowledging traditional owners of the country and the land and the waters that we meet today. I'm in the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations land. It's where I live and play and work most of my time. And I'd like to respect their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty in Australia has never been ceded in battle or bargain, and that we are on lands that always were and always will be Aboriginal lands. I would also like to, at this point, acknowledge some of those on who have helped me on my journey through this, some of who are with us, some of who are not with us, some of who are behind bars because of their work and their rights. And I feel it's really important when we start this space to recognize that we're on a journey together, and that journey is a very diverse. In coming into this work, you meet incredible people doing incredible things, and that they stay with you and they walk with you on this journey. So I am going to be doing a history of CSW and civil society engagement. I'll skip this one because it's just about that. I'm going to start off by talking about CSW and how it started. So the UN, as we know, came about after the Second World War in 1945, when the Charter was ratified. And the Commission on the Status of Women is now and became in 1946 a functional commission on the Economic and Social Council of the UN. So we'll get to what that means a little bit later. And it's the principal governing body, which is exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women. So since 1945, this is the principal body that has been working in the UN. And on the right there, you see the little picture of them gathering for the first time at Hunter College, which is in New York, and it's India, China, Poland, Lebanon, Dominican Republic, France, chaired by Denmark. And this is the very first meeting of that subcommission on the status of women. I'm going to put it a little bit into context here, because in the first meeting, so in 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was heading, obviously the president of the United States, wife at that time, called on governments to encourage women everywhere to take a more active part in national and international affairs, and on women who are conscious of their opportunities to come forward and share in the work of peace and reconstruction as they did in war and resistance. So what we're seeing here is that whole shift that happened through the Second World War on attitudes towards women. Women were taking, were taking a more active role in society. And I've just put a little bit down the bottom there, because while this is happening in New York, what's happening in Australia is we've just got our first women elected into Parliament. So in 1943, that was the very first into federal Parliament. However, our Aboriginal women didn't get the vote till 1960. So we know there's a lot to happen there. What's also happening in this region, and I'm going to put this in because, excuse me, we're going to be talking about the Pacific, is nuclear testing was happening in the Pacific. Now, this nuclear testing was happening by France and the UK. Why was that happening? Because countries were still colonized in there. So Bikini Atoll, which was one of the biggest disasters in the area in the Pacific, was through 1946 to 1958. So while these discussions were happening in New York, women were being, Pacific Islands were being destroyed through nuclear testing, because they'd shifted, France and England had shifted that testing from the global north into the global south. And just as a reminder that the Fiji, that Pacific women have been colonized for a very long time, and a reminder that Fiji didn't get its independence till 1970. So when we're putting this into context, there's an awful lot more that's going on in the world. So the Commission on the Status of Women started off as a subcommission in June 1946. As a guiding principle, it was basically put in place to raise the status of women, irrespective of nationality, race, language, religion. So they recognized that it doesn't matter who you are, you should be part of this. So it's really ironic that Indigenous women could be part of the commission, but they couldn't actually vote in their own countries in Australia. It shifted to being a commission in 46. So it was only a subcommission for a short while, and then it became formalized into the commission as part of ECOSOC. And at that time, it was part of a number of organizations that were around. And then it became the Division for the Advancement of Women in 1978. So from 1978 to 2010, it was the Division on the Advancement of Women, or DAW, as we used to call it. And so DAW, at that time, I have to say, was 2 people in an office part-time. It wasn't ever a large part of the UN. It was always very small part. And so in 2000, well, in the lead up to 2010, there was a big civil society campaign to consolidate the different bodies of the women's rights within the UN. So at that time, we had UNIFEM, which used to do the development work. We had ASAGI, who was a high-level position that spoke to the Secretary General. And we had UNRWA, which was a research department. And what happened was we said we needed to have all of these areas working together, and they built up the GEA campaign. So the GEA was about gender equality, bringing it further forward. And from there, in 2010, UN Women was formed. So UN Women became a consolidation of what was UNIFEM, ASAGI, UNRWA, and the Division on the Advancement of Women. And the Commission is still separate to that, but it works very collaboratively with UN Women. The UN structures are very complex, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on these. It's needless to say that there are offices, this sort of lays it out. It's a little bit blurry here, but you have the United Nations, and as an offshoot of that, you've got the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which was set aside. And then you have underneath it the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Secretariat, the Economic and Social Council. And from there, you have tribunals, committees, human rights councils. Now, as I said, I think this is a very complex area, and I find this one slightly easier to understand, because what we're doing is we're going to be looking at the Commission on the Status of Women. It sits under the Economic and Social Council. So when we go to New York, we go to look into the ECOSOC chamber, and that's what it means, Economic and Social Council chamber. So all of its work sits within there. The coordination and the policy that happens there goes into the General Assembly, and the General Assembly is ultimately agreed on by the nations and by the Secretary General. So it's a commission of the Economic and Social Council. It's not a program, and it's not an agency. It's an actual commission that has a role there. Okay, standing on the shoulders of giants. I've called this the road to Beijing and beyond. I'm going to give you a bit of history about the work and the achievements that the Commission has gained across the years. So let's start in 47 to 62. That was a really, foundational time, and they needed to secure the foundations of gender equality. This is a lot around the civil and political areas of getting voting, women in decision making. But from the very start, the Commission forged very close relationships with NGOs and civil society. It recognized right from the very start that it's the women who do the work, that it's the NGOs that often pick up the aftermath of the policies and procedures and practices that happen. And so at that time, from 47 to 62, the issues on the table were really women's rights as human rights. A lot of think back to your grandparents' days and how they might have lived in trying to get work or working. Even when I started work, you weren't allowed to work in the same place as your husband, which was, if you were both in a relationship, you had to leave the organization. A lot of that's now totally shifted, and the younger ones on us, thank goodness you don't have to go through that, So this is really about removing marriage discrimination, increasing women's literature. Those who've worked on education will know these areas, economic empowerment, and starting to look at the harmful and traditional practices on women, but not only that, on violence, because when we look at 1947 to 1962, violence in the home was not considered violence. Only if it was in a public space, it was violence against women. So the International Labour Organization started to come in and talk to them, and then collaboratively they worked on the Convention on Equal Remuneration for Men and Women Workers for work of equal value. And for those of us in the women's space, we are still working on that campaign to this day. And in Victoria, the general pay gap on that is 14.2%. So there you go. And resolutions were adopted, which means that they were starting to be formally recognized and states were going to be agreeing to these actions. And that was looking at measures to abolish practices that violated physical integrity. Traditional practices, as we know, and we have an expert, we have a global expert with Juliana on this, they remain a sensitive issue. And it's not until the 1980s that female genital mutilation or cutting would be recognized as a form of violence. So that came even later than domestic violence. But it was on the table and they brought it to the highlight of the global community. So from 63 to 75, it was really about promoting participation of women in development. This is about saying that women have their own right to determine what kind of development they have. So it focused more on the situations of women in developing countries. We're still in that, 1960s was the wild era of hippie love and, peace, brother. And it was really about trying to understand what else was going on in the world. And in 1975, the Commission was successful in getting an international year for women. And that launched the first World Conference on Women in Mexico. Now, this is the first of 4 major conferences that globally brought women together, and the first one was in Mexico. 133 governments attended that, and 6,000 NGO civil society representatives went into a parallel forum. So much as now when you go to Commission on the Status of Women, for those who've been, there is a parallel forum that goes along with it, and we still attract 6,000 to 9,000 women in those parallel forums. So they're still coming in those numbers to this day. But bear in mind, in 1963 and 75, travel was not as easy as it was pre-COVID. I'm not going to say it's easy now because with COVID restrictions, it's very difficult. But in 1960 to 75, it was very expensive to travel. So to get that number of women was incredible. And just to put a little bit of Australia in there, we signed CEDAW. Oh, sorry. So on the other side of that, what else was happening in the world is that the membership of the UN was rising. So the membership, this is partly to do with other countries becoming independent, but also there was an agreement that the UN was becoming a real major body for shift and change and collaboration. And there was a real rise in the discrimination against women. And in 1980, why have I got 1983 in there? I don't know why that's in there. Ignore that. Okay, so that should have been on this slide. So in 1976 to 1985, this was the big time of action for women's rights and women's gender equality. And so from the recommendations from Mexico, the UN declared that 76 to 85 was going to be a decade for women, peace, development and equality. So in 79, CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, all forms of discrimination against women, sorry, was adopted, and it came into force in 1981. Australia signed it in 1983, as you saw on the slide before. So, it took 4 years for us to agree to actually sign and ratify that. And we didn't sign the optional protocol till much later. And then there was the Second World Conference, which happened in Denmark. And this was used as an opportunity not only to strengthen CEDAW, but to strengthen the Commission on the Status of Women and to really give them a foothold into the work that they were doing. In 1985, this was This was one of the largest gatherings that happened, and this was in Nairobi. And from this was where the start of the Beijing Platform for Action, which I have in my hand, actually came about. So these forward-looking strategies was the start of the discussion. So from 85 to 95, which was when Beijing happened, there was a lot of work done on these critical areas and defining the critical areas and new emerging areas. And from there, what's this? The World Conference to Review and Appraise, that's it. Participants, so there was 1,900 delegates from 157 member states. So if you think about it, the last one was 133 delegates and 6,000. And here we had in Nairobi, there were 1,900 delegates, 157 member states, along with, that's in addition to, representatives of the UN Secretariat, its regional commissions, its 8 specialized agencies, 17 intergovernmental organizations, 4 national liberation movements, which were countries that were going through independence, and 163 NGOs. And the parallel, that was within the formal commission itself. So think how large that was. And then there were 12,000 participants from the parallel selection. So just think how huge Nairobi was, right? And this was this was just incredible that this is the third World Conference, and it's bringing together this number of people in 1995. And it's the end of that decade for women. So 86 to 95, the commission really starts to solidify, and it meets annually, its membership increases, violence against women, it becomes a public matter. And these have got the strong links with CEDAW and the advocacy that came out of this movement. So don't underestimate CSW or the Commission on the Status of Women. Historically, it's got this huge push behind it, and we stand literally on the shoulders of giants in these groundbreaking areas. So violence really becomes a strong part, and as we know, violence is the most prevalent issue for women in the world. It cuts across all areas. So the Commission started to draft the Declaration on Ending Violence Against Women. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in this decade was brought about. And in 1995, the 4th World Conference of Women, Peace and Development happened in Beijing. And from there, we got the Beijing Platform for Action, which is what we've been working on since 1995. Now, there weren't as many people in Beijing, and there was a lot of different stories. And for those of you on the call here, some of you may have been to Beijing. A lot of you I know were very active in getting people to Beijing. Australia sent 2 flights to Beijing, and there was fear that by the Chinese government that at that time, that these wild women would run naked through the streets. So they separated everyone out, and they put the civil society part in Huaro. But this was really groundbreaking. But I want to also highlight that in this period of time, when we were moving along in women's rights, we weren't only in this space, we were also talking about what was happening with the environment and development. And the big conferences on environment development were happening in Rio de Janeiro, the World Conference on Human Rights happened in 93 in Vienna. In 94, we had the Conference on Population and Development. So sexual and reproductive work was really getting worked on here. In 95, we had the World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen. Habitat 2, which is around housing and land rights, was happening on human settlements in 96, and the World Food Summit, which covers food security, etc., was happening in Rome. So there's a lot else going on, and women were now really starting to get very active in both spaces, and the messages were cross-cutting. And I think it's important to remember that, because that's what's happening now in this CSW this year. So what came out of Beijing? The Beijing Platform for Action. Now it looks like this. It's a little blue book, and it gets very, weathered and torn. This is my posh one that I get out for. My real one's all tattered. The Platform for Action looks at 12 critical areas which were identified as issues for women, and even then media was in. It's interesting because these shifted and changed over the years, and so we have the areas of poverty, education, health, violence, armed conflict, women in the economy, power and decision making, institutional and human rights, media, environment, and girl child. And the way that they were framed really, and Juliana and I really love this picture because it shows you that the body of the work is on the dress, and the body of the work are those critical areas and really getting equality in there. But you can't do it without the institutional arrangements and the financial arrangements. And so that's really where the power and decision making and the institutional mechanisms and the financing of this work happens. You need to carry that with you, and the strategic direction is the way you're walking. So it's really, I like this image because that's the mission of the Beijing Platform for Action. And in consideration of that, across the years, and I'm not going into detail on all of these, but we've got CEDAW, we have the International Convention on Population and Development, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We already had the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. All of these came into, in one way or another, into this platform, and they fed through. So all of the human rights conventions and treaties support and strengthen and collaborate with the platform, and the platform acts on these multiple levels. So it's not just about women, it's about intersectional women in all of their diversities. More recently, we've got the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These are also now taken up and carried with the Platform for Action. So it's a moving, active beast that we work with. From 96 to 2005, really the Commission has been working on advancing the progress for women, and CSW implemented a multi-year program of work. So that's a 5-year review, and every 5 years we review. And nationally, so some of you on this call today were part of the B+25 that happened in 2019 in preparation for the 2020 meeting. And that was the last big session that we had pre-COVID. In 2000, it was really interesting because Kofi Annan was the Secretary General at this time, and he recognized that the world had shifted from 1995 when we got the platform, because it was very progressive. The Beijing Platform for Action is a very progressive piece of work for that time. And in 2000, the world had shifted. There was a lot more conservative forces in the world. There was a lot of pushback. So Kofi Annan said, well, we're not going to open this up. We're not going to open the document up to be rewritten. What we're going to do is we're going to review it. And so in 2000, there was a review and appraisal of the Platform for Action, which added on, it brought out a lot of different new and emerging areas, such as IT, the internet. In 1995, the internet wasn't as big as it was in 2000. In 2000, everybody was on the internet. So the issue of media, the issue of internet, that was one of the areas. The other area that was really big was HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS wasn't really that prevalent in 1995. It had come forward. So there were new areas that were coming up, and the decision was made that the platform would not be reopened as a document. And this is an argument that's going on now and probably be touched on later. And that it would be reviewed every 5 years in its entirety. So all 12 critical areas would be reviewed, and new and emerging issues would be brought into the Commission, and that would form the basis of the Commission's work for the next 5 years. So when there's a Beijing review, there's also a review of the programme of work within CSW. The optional protocol to CEDAW was accepted in 1999. Australia didn't sign up till 2009 with Kevin Rudd, but the optional protocol brought in different areas, and Helen's on this call, she can talk to the CEDAW protocol, but it brings in areas such as parental leave, care and the facilities, that sort of thing. 2006 to 2015, we were zooming ahead. CSW improved its methods of work. The +5 is +25. We're moving into +30 soon. The GEA campaign established UN Women from the 4 agencies, as I mentioned earlier. And UN Women prioritized support for the strengthening of a comprehensive set of global norms and standards on gender equality. So this, in 2015, some of you will remember the predecessor of the Sustainable Development Goals that were called the Millennium Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals were brought about as a new process that was going to achieve development and, of course, women's rights, and that was happening. And at the same time, Kofi Annan started the UN reform, and the UN reform, so the bringing together of the 4 agencies was part of the bigger UN reform that Kofi Annan had started and put in place. And it's amazing how much I remember of that time, even though it seems so long ago. 2015 to 2030, we're now starting to move forward, and this is the new agenda of CSW. In 2015, with the Millennium Development Goals, there started to be a linkage between Millennium Development Goals and the Commission on the Status of Women work, because the Beijing Platform for Action, CEDAW, and the Millennium Development Goals all speak to each other. They, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals came out, and the good thing about the Sustainable Development Goals that is different to the Millennium Development Goals is that with the Sustainable Development Goals, they're universal. So they apply to everybody, whether they are, it's not just your development agenda, it is also what's happening in countries. So for Australia, they were using the Millennium Development Goals as a framework for work, gendered work offshore, but they weren't necessarily looking at what was happening in country. So now with the Sustainable Development Goals, they have to do that. And, 25 years of the Beijing Platform for Action. So what's the difference here? Here's the 2 side by side. You've got Beijing Platform for Action, which is 12 critical areas of concern reviewed every 5 years to bring it up to date. These are the policy areas that are discussed within CSW. And then you've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals, 169 targets, 231 unique targets, even though 12 of them are repeated. And this is something that has to happen by 2030. And why am I talking about this? Because we have generation equality. So suddenly, what happened was when we got to the Beijing 25 review, there needed to be a revigoration for the next 5 years to really push some of these goals across the line. And why? So what happened? We set up the Generation Equality program. So this came about not just because of the 25th anniversary of Beijing Platform for Action, but we were also into the Security Council Resolution 1325 20th anniversary. We were at the 10th anniversary of the UN Women's establishment for the Global Champion of the Empowerment of Women, and the 5th anniversary on the Global. So it was a big review that was happening at the time. They needed a push on women's rights to get some of these things that were so close across the line. So generation equality was set up. Unfortunately, COVID hit. So we can't take generation equality away from COVID, because the plan of it to be this vibrant, vigorous action coalitions that were going to get us across the line were suddenly stifled. And so the plans that were due to take place in 2020 didn't happen until 2021, but there was still strong governments behind this. And there were 2 meetings that took place. Very few people, it was a very high level meeting. So only those who could be in the room were in the room. There was very little civil society. In fact, there were no civil society in the room. They were all virtual. So this was a kind of hybrid meeting that took place. IWDA in Australia is heading up one of the action coalitions. So, but we see here there is an action coalition on the climate justice. So this was one of the areas that were really keen. So it's bringing voices together in a different way. The aim of it was, as I said, to catalyze collective action, to have those local and global and regional conversations, dive into investments, because now the role of public sector is coming into this area a lot. Funding is coming in from these areas. We've seen it for a long time with very conservative groups that they're funded through the sector. And this is an important one to remember for this year, because we're talking climate change, we're talking environment, we're talking mining companies, oil companies, big major money we're talking about. So just hold that to one side. What happened was generation equality was deemed a success. It gave us 40 billion in financial commitments, some which are tied to other money, some which are tied to specific areas. It says that there were nearly 50,000 people engaged in the forum. That was over a 3-year process, and the number of smaller groups, driven predominantly by NGO CSW and the amazing small team they have there to make sure that this didn't, and UN Women worked very, very hard to bring these groups together. And we got the launch of the Global Partner Network for Feminist Foreign Policy, and IWDA in Australia is one of the leads in that. So, it wasn't a complete thing. It seems, unfortunately, to have fizzled out, and there's no strong connection between their agenda and CSW as we're seeing it. The other thing that we have to think about for this year is that we have the UN climate change conferences, or what we call COP. Now, this will be a new area for a lot of people. And some of you would have heard about the COP summit that happened in Glasgow last year in November. And this was to bring about, CSW is not the only thing that happens in the UN, and it's not the only thing that impacts on women. And so when you're looking at climate change, you have to think about what's called the Paris Agreements, and the Paris Agreements and the Doha Agreements, which is the funding area, all sort of merge in together, and it gets very messy. But what came out of COP, some were positive, some of it wasn't. So we'll be trying, some of those who were at COP will be trying to get these goals across the line in CSW. So we've got a hook to talk to. Australia took a pretty conservative view, a pretty conservative stance at COP, but we did sign the Glasgow Climate Pact. And that's basically, Boris Johnson got that across the line. He might be a clown, but he's Boris Johnson, and he got it across the line. So that was really to get this compact on mitigation, which is to reduce emissions, adaptation to help those already impacted by climate change, and finance to enable countries to reach their climate goals, and collaboration. So this is sort of what came out of COP, and there is a whole feminist agenda that came out of it that we're not going to go into today. So when we think of today's right, this is this year's. Now we're getting to the messy bit, and I've tried to keep it as clean as possible. We've got the COP, and behind that, if you remember, we were talking about the Rio Summit and the conventions, the sustainable development work. The Rio Summit produced the Kyoto Protocol, which is something that covers a lot of the areas that we're still talking about. They feed into the Glasgow Climate Compact in 26. I'm not going to go into all of that, but they're covering the Paris Agreements, the Doha Agreements. So Doha Agreements is funding for development, and Paris Agreements are the agreements on climate change. We also, and we shouldn't forget this because it was missed out of the zero draft, and Helen will probably talk on this later, the frameworks for disaster risk reduction. So we have in here the Sendai framework for disaster and risk reduction, which goes on till 2030, and that was brought out in Japan. And that's really about, that we've had tsunamis, we've had bushfires, we've had earthquakes, we've had so many disasters that these frameworks have come out, and we've got the Samoa pathway, which is the one that was brought about through island states. So these are very, very important frameworks for disaster risk reduction. You might hear this, there's a lot of this about reduction. Where's the strengthening of women in recovery? And we'll come to that when we get to how we can work within CSW to take some of this into a different direction. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got the Commission on the Status of Women, which is working with these documents of the BPFA, Bergen Platform for Action, CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW Optional Protocol, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are really kind of now fading into the policy areas because of the merging. We've got the climate people over in these are government. So the Glasgow Climate Comet, the COP is government predominantly, but civil society interacts with that. And there's a lot of women who work there, will be in this space this year. We've got those on disaster risk reduction. We've got a lot of corporate interests coming up. So you can guarantee that the ILO, or the International Labour Organization, and some of the trade unions will also probably have a big interest. And, you know, that's something Helen and I have seen a lot over the last couple of years, of the trade unions coming into the space of CSW where they weren't so much before. Then we've got the two things that come out of, we've got the Feminist Action for Climate Justice, which comes out of gender equality and the SDGs, and we've got the Gender, Climate and Security. Now, what's missing here is the Women, Peace and Security, and that will almost certainly come in, because where there is humanitarian disaster, that is not just, you know, that's man-made as well as natural. So you've got conflict that has to overlay on this. Where are we now in the process? All right, so this is the process of CSW. We're moving into how CSW kind of operates. So you've got CSW, which happens every year at New York. As it moves through its cycle, you have regional high level, it's a regional high level government meeting, and then you go into the next, you know, kind of process. But in between that, you have a preparatory meeting. So what happens is at CSW this year, they will talk about what's going to happen at CSW next year. And from that, they will say, right, we need to have some sort of expert group. So the UN Women preparation for CSW happens the year before. They then, towards November, they have an expert group meeting, which is academics, civil society, UN, that come together to discuss the theme. That outcomes from that inform the Secretary General's report. The Secretary General's report, the expert group meeting outcomes, all impact and influence the drafting of the CSW outcomes document or agreed conclusions. So that's where the zero draft comes from. So they're spoken about at the regional level. The Asia Pacific's not too good on this, but generally there would be a preparatory meeting, and civil society in the region pushed SCAP. So SCAP is the Economic Social of the Asia Pacific, to have a preparatory meeting, but there was no civil society preparatory meeting that was formalized. This is one of the first times it hasn't really happened, and it's because of the virtual online space. There's not the opportunities to come together and to get the outcomes online that you get face to face. And this is, you know, this is part of a bigger discussion of the way that NGOs are interfacing now with these processes. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So yeah, that becomes the zero draft that goes out to governments. So now our government, the Australian government, received the zero draft at the beginning of February. We are very lucky with the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Caucus that work together collaboratively to have got that document and to have been able to influence our own government on language that went in. And then from there, it goes back. It's now, the zero draft has gone back. I think the 3rd of March, is it, Helen? 3rd of March is the next expected round. And so that it will go from a 10-page document to a 50-page document. I'm not going to go on to that because Helen's going to cover that later. Needless to say, this is how it affects, right? So this messy little thing here is kind of, with Australia in the middle, is how the global to local, and if anybody says the personal is not political, they can get out of this room because there's no way you're not covered in this area. So Australia has to interact with the Commission and interact with CEDAW, Commission on the Status of Women, and the Beijing Platform for Action. It has to interact with the Convention on, so, you know, it's messy. It's messy. And it's, but the good things that we have is we have mechanisms that come through this. So we've got the Human Rights Commission, we've got WGEA, which is the Workplace Gender Equality Commissioner, we've got the Sex Discrimination Commission. Australia has also, to deal with some of this mess, built national action plans. So we have 2 major national action plans, one on women, peace and security, and one on violence against women. The one on violence against women is currently being in its 4th review, and I'm not going to talk about national action plans at this point. Civil society have the opportunity here through the CEDAW shadow reporting, through Beijing platform reviews, through annual discussions with government on the policy reviews for CSW. So there's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of points here where civil society can interact, but there's the key reporting for government are on the Beijing Platform for Action through the Commission on the Status of Women, CEDAW, which is in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and the SDG reporting, which happens at the High Level Political Forum, which happens twice a year, once in June and then once in September, which is when they're really measuring the balance on that. So let's come into, I'm nearly at my time, so I'm going to go through this, I'm just going to quickly do the thematic areas. This is what's happening this year. So it's climate change, environment, disaster and risk reduction. And because of the continued impact of COVID, it's a hybrid issue. So what's happened is the UN have requested that government delegations send delegations to New York. Civil society are not allowed into the UN at this point. Those with an annual pass can get in and out of the building, but the doors are going to be sealed, and there's real practical reasons for that. So the priority theme is achieving gender equality, empowerment of women and girls. And girls is coming very strongly through this. I just want to add that in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So again, recovery is missing from that title. Review theme is women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. So what will happen is the majority of the whole of the zero draft is about the priority theme. The review theme is a roundtable discussion that basically there's a report comes out, but it's not held in a lot of importance, but they're making sure that it's on track. The other thing that is really important is the methods of work will be discussed in this session. Now, why are the methods of work important? The methods of work are responding to the changes in the theme and are really about the key point for the methods of work, and why it's important for us to think about it, to look at it and to discuss it, is because this is about civil society interface with the UN and with the Commission on the Status of Women. Over the last few years, there's been a major push to limit numbers, to limit access. They do this in a number of ways. Organizations have a limited number of passes. So a global organization will only have 20 registrants for CSW, and then they will limit however many can go in the room. So if you go into one of the big sessions, there's only one from that organization can go in. So for example, for the opening ceremony, there's only one of those 20 can actually attend the room, and it's about limiting numbers. The other thing that they've been doing as a strategy, and I'm sure Helen will touch on this, is when you're outside the room, is they are limiting the numbers of people in the room and saying it's an OH&S issue. It's so they're literally, if there are 7 seats in the room, you've got 7 people in the room, and that's it. And it's going to be worse with COVID. So there's a lot of practical reasons why it's a hybrid this year. But the key thing is that there's a big recognition that there's been a pushback, and there was a number of us invited into a discussion with Maris Burbergs from Latvia, who is the vice chair for the Eastern European group and is the drafter of the methods of work. He's the poor, I was going to say poor bugger, but I'll say poor person who has to be the interface between government and civil society. And so there's been an active role and a reach out by that group to actually speak to NGO groups. And so Australia had an opportunity through the Office of Women and the mission in New York to actually have a one-on-one conversation with him this week, which was very important. And he's asked us for, Mali was part of that. Mali, your hand's up. Do you want to say something?
Yes, sorry, Carole. I'm going to ask a silly question.
No silly questions.
Give me another rundown of the role of the methods of work, because I'm still struggling to get my head around how it interacts with CSW.
Okay, so it's it's the operational procedures around it, I suppose. It's the way that it's who you let in, who you don't let in, where they can go, where they can't go, how the program's going to run. The program of work is the agenda, is what are going to be the 5 key policy areas that we're going to discuss, right? But this is more about the operations of the room. Who does the chairing, who does the so there's a chair, there's a committee, there's a room. Civil society are not allowed in the room, they are allowed in the room. So this is really for us, when we talk about civil society engagement, which is of course the area that I have been engaging in, is really trying to ensure that women and that civil society, not just women, but that civil society are in the room, that they have a voice. And we've been pushing for a very long time for an equal voice. So different UN processes work in different ways. So when you go to the high-level political forum, which happens in June and measures the Sustainable Development Goals, civil society have a role in the agenda where they speak on equal footing to the governments. In CSW, you don't have that. There are spaces, there are interventions, and part of it is that in recent years, civil society interventions have been put to the end of the day. And what happens is the governments walk out the room, so nobody hears it, right? It's a tactic, it's a strategy. So we are saying things like, we really want to have the intervention spaced, so 3 governments, 1 person, the civil society, but it's also around the realities of having civil society in the room can cause a lot of problems for governments within both when they go home, because governments, it's a government room and they want to be able to speak in a way that governments speak to each other. But geopolitics is really a big area. So that's really what the methods, I'll not go into that side of it. The methods of work's really important this year because we have to look at the critical role of NGOs and CSW and encourage them to encourage states to have us in the room. And to be honest, it was not about selling civil society in the room to the person who's writing the report. He was for us, he was with us, he saw the value of it. The UN see the value of having civil society in the room, but government, progressive voices in the UN states in these discussions, especially on the issues of women. And we're seeing big pushback on sexual and reproductive health and rights. We're seeing different, that's why it's really important. Is that answering your question? I'm happy to talk about it.
No, that is super clarifying. Thank you. I feel like I now understand.
Yeah.
I speak with Maris a lot better. Thank you. Yeah.
So that's why it's important. Where am I? Methods of work. The formal outcomes, and Helen's going to talk about this. This is going to be the agreed conclusions. I don't think there's any resolutions being on the table at this point, and then the methods of work. So that will be, if there are resolutions that come up, and there's still time for them to come up. With the virtual world, it's just too hard for them to. There's physical space issues and there's virtual space issues. So how can you participate? And I've put these little flags on. So the UN delegation, this is to actually go in and draft the conclusions and work on the methods of work. So this year it's purely a government space. It's always a government space for negotiation. Civil society doesn't get to speak, although you often have civil society embedded in the delegation. And they're going to have a hybrid space with, now the discussion we had, and this is just new, so Helen, you might not have heard it, is they might have to even put the negotiations across 3 rooms because they're only allowing one. They want to have 1+1, which is 1 person and 1 helper from each government. So they're not working in the big commission rooms. They're not working in the big rooms. They're working in the smaller conference rooms and room spaces because it's a challenge. So even with the government delegation this year, if there is 1 person in, which will be the mission, and the rest will be sitting outside waiting. So that's the reason they're not letting civil society in, because governments are taking over the couches instead of civil society. Now, the challenge, the real challenge we're going to have here in Australia is what we had last year, which is we're like way behind the ball game because of the time zone challenges. We find out after the event, and that's really not where we want to be. And so, you know, we'll talk a bit about that. The other way is through side events. There are side events. All of the side events are virtual. To get a side event, you have to be supported by a member state, by one of the governments, and they are formal parts of the UN program. And they're a sort of UN governed space. And then you've got this wonderful free for all, which has got this massive attendance, and that's the parallel sessions. They're all virtual. I call this the future forward space, because this is really where you're finding out what's really going on, and UN and governments come into this space a lot to find out what's happening. So you're finding out what's the new and emerging issues, you're finding out what's happening with groups and organizations, you're finding out how, you know, new solutions, new challenges, new possibilities. It's a really amazing, vibrant, moving space. Where you learn, share, educate, create networks, build common platforms. And this is an NGO governed space. And I use the word governed loosely because you need a framework and governance around it, but it is, so that's through NGO CSW New York, but there is an NGO CSW in the Asia Pacific as well that works on that. And that is me done. So I'm open to any questions. Is there anything in the chat? It was a lot of information. We've gone on a long journey. I hope I didn't tire you out. So happy to take any questions very quickly, or we can address them later.
There was one question in the chat about how CSW has centred the voices of First Nations women and women of colour over the years. They've heard that in UN mechanisms on environmental and climate change conferences, Indigenous people's knowledge has historically been sidelined, and their voices only added in to assimilate into Western frameworks. So I don't know if you know much about that, or could answer the question at all.
Well, yeah, I can sort of address some of that. First of all, with the Western, I'll take the Western frameworks part first. There are some countries that reckon the UN is a Western framework. And, you know, from some perspectives, we have to recognize there are multiple perspectives, and to some, that would certainly seem to be. And that's part of the pushback, which is why, and Helen will talk about this a little bit later, which is why we also push for regional agreements to be mentioned in the agreed conclusions, because often the regional agreements are stronger and they feel more owned than an international agreement. So I'll talk a little bit of that. That's kind of with that. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You know, it's a long behemoth mechanism, but the UN is the UN is made up of states, you know, so it is what it is. It's part of that beast. So if you're part of that beast, you're part of that problem as well as part of that discussion. With regards to centering of Indigenous and First Nation voices, that what we're seeing is it's not that it's centering, it's they're often excluded within a lot of UN processes, as women are, as women with disability are, as, you know, my refugee women. I did a lot of work with refugee women and migrant women, and they are also off centre. But you've got now the Convention on Indigenous Peoples, and you've also got the Convention on Disability, which is bringing that voice a little bit stronger in, because now we have international law that has fed into domestic law that is saying you have to look at that. So that's brought part of changing the structure, which is what really we're trying to do, is changing the way that it's looked. With regards to what was the first part? There was something about women of colour. It's a long question, isn't it?
Yes, but just how CSW may centre or work towards, you know, not sidelining First Nations and women of colour voices as they have historically been.
Yeah, so I think there's been a real shift in that. There's been a shift and change in that. It's not, and this is right. This is from the governments. Right, this is not civil society, because you go to CSW. Now, there is a bit of an issue with Indigenous, with the First Nations peoples, in that the Latina group Latin American caucus for that is extremely strong. So if you don't speak Spanish or one of the Latin American countries, it's quite difficult to tag in. And I know when I've gone with Indigenous women, there's fabulous Indigenous women from Australia who've been. They have had a little bit of a problem putting that in. So they've worked nationally and internationally to raise it in other ways. You get larger numbers, and this is to do with funding, is there's large numbers of women from say Africa and from the Caribbean that can go to CSW, that can physically go into that space because they're funded through their programs to go. Whereas, if you look at Australia, it's very hard to find funding to go to New York. So there's that. But certainly within the discussions, and Helen will talk on this, it's probably a better point for you to think about on this one, Helen, is the way that we try to get those voices, that recognition, because normally it's in a list, and the UN hates lists, so it becomes the diversity of all women is the catchphrase. And I don't want to move into that because we're going to do that in the next session. But I hope that's, whoever asked that question, does that answer your question? Marley, you've got another hand up.
Sorry, I've got another question. I guess, and this is kind of building on what we saw in the Zero draft this year. How has, especially in the past, I would say 3 or so years, CSW navigated gender inclusive language beyond just using women and girls? Like, has there been any kind of push from any type of civil society or even state governments to broaden it?
Helen's going to touch a bit on this. What I'll say to you is that lesbians have been there from the beginning, right? Let's just say the L in LGBTQI have been in there. There's a lot feel that L's been pushed out. I know that that's part of the discussion. The inclusiveness of sexuality is a real challenge, and I'm going to let Helen talk to that because it's really part of that next session. The Secretary General brought about a report. It was about 2017, 2018 on trans women, was it? Round about then, and that gave us the language and the ability. You see, the way we use these documents is they're hooks, right? So if something that comes out, we can say, well, it's in that report that this is blah blah blah. But the whole issue about language and that inclusivity that we're talking about is very difficult in this setting because we have some states that won't even talk about girls. They don't recognize the existence of girls. So we have to shift it from the national dialogue and recognize that in an international dialogue, some of the issues are very, very different, and that's why it's important to know that, we're here now and we're still moving forward and there's still room to move.
I think we've got time for one more question. Matilda, have we got one in the chat there?
Yes, Kirsten has just asked a question about Australia's government has been ignoring the formal output of national conventions and inquiries. So how important are the written documents compared with the meeting itself and the work of the various organisations?
The written documents are the ones that you can leverage off, is the bottom line to that. And I think Sally's going to talk about this later on, bringing it home and finding out how to use it. And Helen and I were talking yesterday, and it's just very, very interesting that I've been working predominantly internationally and regionally for a very long time. And I've seen the way that women in other countries have used outcomes documents as hooks to get real action and change on the ground and to get that transformative change happening. And it's only now that Australia is starting to do that. And it's quite interesting because it shows there's a whole political climate behind it that's happening. But I'll leave that one as well for Helen to pick. So you're getting all of, I hope you kept notes, Helen. And Sally will talk about bringing it home and how we use the documents when we come back. I have to say the way that Australia generally works is it does not agree to anything if it's not already doing it. So when we go into forums, we've already pre-planned what we will and won't do. And I was part of the big movement. I mean, my work in this space, or the majority of my work in this space, has been around armed conflict and the push for Security Council Resolution 1325, which we eventually got in 2000. That's shown how old I am now, right? Some of you weren't born in 1995. But in 2000, we got that across the line. And then it's, you know, it's an ongoing struggle, because now we've got a national action plan, we've got, you know, and where is it? You know, let's not go into that direction. But yeah, so hopefully that answers that. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Carole. That was absolutely fantastic. Every time you speak, I learn new things. And so I am thrilled to have the opportunity to listen to you again.
Thank you.
I'm also thrilled that we've got that recorded, because that was so rich, that I think it's going to be a resource for us for some time. I think we need a couple of minutes for everybody to have a